we'll talk a great deal about contrast in these lessons. Contrast is what makes your images look interesting. As a DP, you're going to be asked to create a wide variety of contrast ratios depending on the subject material. The most commonly used ratio is 4:1. 4:1 is very pleasing. It's very pleasing to look at. It's not too dark. It's not too flat. It's used a lot in dramatic television, stuff like House, Fringe, Law and Order, romance movies like Jerry Maguire, dramas. It's everywhere. 8:1 and 16:1 are reserved for like darker pieces, your horror movies, sci-fi, comic book movies, that sort of thing, noir movies. And then 2:1. And 2:1, and sometimes 1:1 are what I call the chick flick look. It's relatively flat. It's very flattering for women, especially older women. It's used on talk shows, romantic comedies, interviews, kind of like this. It's very harmless, non-intimidating look. Now, the contrast ratio is determined by the differences between exposures. Most commonly, the difference between the exposure between your key light and your fill light on a person's face. Now, it's not to be confused with dynamic range. Dynamic range we'll cover a bit later, and it refers more to the contrast across the entire frame, like these shadows back here and the highlights here on this little leaf blower here and my face. This is dynamic range. The whole scene is dynamic range. But contrast ratio really tends to be limited to your subjects, or the people in your scene. And luckily for you, it'll take you a while. Eventually this will become second nature, but on the back of your gray card, which I linked you to, there's a cheat sheet over here. You can see, like right here. And it says, calls them lighting ratios, but it's contrast ratios. You want to keep the exposure on your DSLRs to within, at least on your faces, to right around that 8:1 range. That's probably max. That's probably the max you want to go to. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. I'll bring in some friends of mine. We'll do some 3-point lighting setups, and then I'll show you the difference between 2:1, 4:1, 8:1, so that you can see the difference. And the problem that you have with the DSLR is, since the dynamic range is really kind of limited to 6 stops, there's a really tight window of about 4 stops, 2 stops above average and 2 stops below average, where you want to try and squeeze your exposures to where you have actual detail. You have detail in the shadows and detail in the highlights. And so with faces, since you want to get skin tone about a stop above, or about 2/3 of a stop above even, you've only got about 2 1/3 stops. So according to our cheat sheet here, 2 1/3 stops is a 5:1 ratio. I'm sorry, 2 2/3 stops, which is about a 6:1 ratio. And then 3 stops is 8:1. So that's, if you're overexposing your skin tones a little bit, and then you're coming right down to like the very, very bottom of actually retaining detail in the shadows, you're gonna have about 8:1. So 6:1 is kind of what I'd shoot for. 8:1 tops. Any more than that, you're really gonna run into problems in post when you start to do color correction, or if you want to power window something and trying to get some detail back. But anyway, that's contrast. We'll take a deeper look at that, and then we'll move on to 3-point lighting, which should be a lot of fun.